When it comes to coaching for MMA, there are a lot of opinions thrown out all over the place. When the fighters that a certain coach trains are on the rise, the coaches are often hailed as the builders of champions and treated like enlightened sages. And when their fighters begin to lose, fans are quick to blame the coaches, saying that fighters should leave the camp they're at, which is a phenomenon that often happens because it's much easier to blame a coach than it is to say that a fighter you like fell short. However, what constitutes good coaching in mixed martial arts? And what are the intricacies that viewers might not see from the outside looking in? Well, I recently had the opportunity to get a glimpse into that world, and that is through meeting this guy.
My name is Ryan Kim Cafaro. I am a professional MMA fighter. I am also a professional MMA coach, but I'm currently here in Tokyo, Japan to adjust to the time zone because I will be fighting Koyomi Matsushima at Rizin 53 in Kobe, Japan, where I'll be making my Rizin debut.
In addition to now being a Rizin fighter, which makes him an automatic target of my glaze, Ryan is one of the highest level MMA coaches currently on the scene.
In terms of people I've worked with in the past, I've worked with Eddie Alvarez, Frankie Edgar, Zaruka Dashev, Bill Algeo, Sajar Eubanks, Caitlin Chukagian, Claudia Gadelia. These are all the UFC athletes that I've coached. And then I currently coach Corey Anderson. And I've also worked with Paul Felder pretty extensively throughout his career. I cornered Marlon Moraes before in the main event of Fortaleza, Brazil against Rafael Assunção. And that's about all that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
And if you're wondering about how I got in touch with Mr. Cafaro, it was because Ryan replied to a post of mine on Twitter where I was making fun of an American who was posting their steak, where he was using Google Translate to tell me in Japanese that steaks are very good and nutritious, and I proceeded to tell him I was joking. And yeah, from there, I asked him if he'd be willing to make a video with me, and he said yes, and I ended up linking up with him here in Tokyo. And from there, we came up with the idea for this video. And just to prove that I'm not AI, and that I'm doing this in person, here's me asking Ryan a question in person. To put it simply, what do you think is the most... Number one, what do you think beyond anything else is the most necessary thing for a coach to have in MMA?
I think that the most important thing for a coach to have in MMA would be probably a combination of knowledge combined with, I would say, synergy with the athlete. Because if you don't have knowledge, you can't teach anything. And if you don't have synergy with your athlete, then your athlete won't trust in anything that you're teaching them.
A great example of said synergy that Ryan is talking about here is when Ryan duct taped pads to his feet while holding mitts for Corey Anderson while they were preparing for a 6'8" opponent. And I mean, it does look silly, but hey, Corey Anderson ended up winning that fight, so it works. And from that point forward, I just proceeded to ask Ryan a bunch of questions relating to MMA coaching. And the first question, of course, I asked was, what was the best example of MMA coaching that came to mind?
I think a great example of some high-level coaching I've seen recently, I saw Eric Nixick, and he was working really, really well in the corner of a lot of his fighters, and a lot of it is he's very, he can switch from being very technical to then understanding when it's time to shift into more of a firing your athlete up in the correct way. So I've seen him, say, hey, I need certain combinations on this, that, and the third. But then other times it's hey, motherfucker, are you ready to burn the boats? Go get this guy. You know what I mean? So it's cool to see a dynamic of someone like Coach Eric Nixick being very technical with someone like Paul Felder at times. And then sometimes with Dan Ige, he's what are we going to do? Fuck him up. So it's you can tell that's a coach that has great relationships and synergy and chemistry with his fighters.
And of course, since I asked him what good coaching is, I had to go ahead and ask him what bad coaching is by contrast, and how sometimes what we think of as fans as bad coaching is actually good coaching, depending upon the situation.
So, it's saying somebody is a bad coach is kind of an interesting, it's kind of an interesting topic because from the outside it may look like bad coaching, but when you know your athlete and something's not going the way you need it to, sometimes you need to say things that wouldn't make sense to somebody else. If I can give an example, if you watched Mark Henry trying to coach Marlon Moraes in his title fight against Henry Cejudo, Coach Mark Henry was criticized in particular for telling Marlon to like think about like his family and his son and his wife when he was tired going to the final round of the Cejudo fight. But at that point, like, Mark Henry and Marlon were so tight, they have such good chemistry in the corner. Like, he was aware of Marlon's state of mind at that point. He was panicking, and if there's no, like, he understood that there was nothing technical that he could tell Marlon at that point. So then Mark is like, all right, well then I'm going to throw a Hail Mary pass in here and see if I can, motivate Marlon to come back here with an emotional speech. It's kind of like a Teddy Atlas sort of like We Are Firemen sort of thing. And I understand why you would say something like that in a time where you may feel desperate or fired up.
But when I asked Ryan for a truly terrible example of coaching, he gave me this answer.
I think that in some respects there are situations where a bad gym can really ruin a fighter. I mean, like, if I remember correctly, there was there was actually I think she was a female boxing coach. I think her last name was like Wolf or something. And she worked with a guy that fought Canelo Alvarez. And I remember people talking about how, like, she would just beat these fighters into the dirt. And I just feel like as a coach, you have to understand having like an understanding of your fighter, especially when they're overtraining, because in our sport and in most combat sports in general, there's always there's like a fear of underdoing it, and fighters have a tendency to push themselves well beyond what they're capable of and often end up in fights overtraining. And if you're not able to recognize that, if you're somebody like the strength and conditioning coach, Coach Cal, who runs some ridiculous training regimen out of his garage that seems like you can only get through it if you're on extracurricular vitamins, if you know what I mean. I don't think that's necessarily beneficial, and I think it can ruin a fighter's career. I mean, if you look at a recent interview, Cub Swanson said that every one of his camps he did when he was doing his strength and conditioning under Coach Cal, he lost his fights and he felt overtrained and drained going into those fights.
And just a fun fact about that particular strength and conditioning gym Ryan was talking about, well, that's TJ Dillashaw's strength and conditioning coach and Hamzat Chimaev and Arman Tsarukyan's strength and conditioning coach right now. So make sure to keep that in mind when picking their fights. And then, next, this is what Ryan had to say about how much a fighter's success has to do with their coaching.
So I feel like it comes to a point where, like, a good coach can bring out the best of a fighter and their potential. Like, there are certain fighters that, like, for example, I think John Jones would have been good no matter where he went in his career. He could have gone to a mom and pop gym in a basement in, I don't know, in like North Dakota or something, and he would still be the champion of the world, in my opinion. But then, there are guys that are probably like middle rung fighters that maybe never would have gotten to like, a 500 record in the UFC without coaches that really like brought them there. Like, I think that, like, if you look at a coach in particular, like the late Duke Roufus had at his prime, like when Woodley and Askren and Felder, Gerald Mearshart, Bilal Muhammad, when all those guys were there at once, like, he had a very large group of fighters that were all succeeding at a very high level in MMA with very different styles. So I feel like his coaching staff and Duke Roufus's approach to combat sports was very interesting, and also was very high level in that sense.
And since Ryan brought up the topic of styles, this is what I had to ask him about head coaches in MMA coming from different backgrounds and different styles.
So when a head coach comes from a specific discipline, I think it's up to the coach to kind of make or break the athlete in terms of what they're going to teach them. Because again, let's say if you're like a striking specialist and you only focus on the striking aspect, but let's say, like, for example, what if like Duke Roufus told Ben Askren, hey, like, you really need to focus on your kickboxing and like stop working on your wrestling so much and your jiu-jitsu so much. Then Ben Askren would not be 18-0 before he retired and then unretired to go to the UFC. So a coach in MMA in particular has to have the nuance to understand, like, hey, I'm going to improve my fighters where they're weak and maybe with my specialty, but then I need to maybe bring in another coach to help with the other areas that I'm not proficient in. And if a coach in particular is not willing to do that, if they let their ego get in the way or something like that, and don't let another specialist kind of help you, then that will probably be the downfall of your career as a coach.
And since we're on the topic of different styles in different countries, and Ryan is fighting in Japan, this is what Ryan had to say about different countries being the strongholds for different styles.
I think that in terms of mixed martial arts, there are obviously like interesting strongholds in terms of like country to country, what you really see like specialists in. I feel like for the longest time it was like obviously Brazil had the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists, and I feel like Japan in particular has been known for having very, very slick, explosive striking, very fundamentally like down the pipe 1-2s and stuff like that. And then you've got countries like the Dutch that have like their Dutch kickboxing backgrounds, Muay Thai from Thailand. But I do feel like in terms of there's a reason that places like Russia and America are probably, in my opinion, two of the main powerhouses of combat sports, because America, in terms of it has it's like the melting pot of culture. So a lot of times you get the best of every combat sport brought into one central hub. It's one of the times where I think a melting pot is a good thing, and I think that like a country like Russia instead is so disciplined and militant with their style of training that it's going to breed success regardless of if there are that many elite coaches. But Russia in particular is doing such a good job of blending elite top control with elite striking with their wushu style of striking combined with their aggressive wrestling.
And then next, since we're on the topic of cultures, I decided to ask Ryan what it's like to coach somebody from a radically different cultural background from him.
I mean, I've had to coach athletes before from many different walks of life, many different religions and cultures. I cornered Zaruka Dashev on Fight Island, and he's Muslim, and there were, it was easy on Fight Island because we were going to the Middle East where everything was halal and very Muslim friendly. But there were situations where coaching prior in a maybe in a different camp, it's very difficult to find foods that work with that fighter's religious beliefs, and it can cause a lot of issues with that fighter's performance and with their ability to cut weight and things like that. So again, like as a coach, there comes a point where you can't just focus on the strategy of the fight. Sometimes you got to do extracurricular research outside of that and maybe understand what your athlete's needs and wants are and what you need to do to help prepare them adequately for especially something like traveling outside of the country or going to unfamiliar territory to compete.
And for my final question for Ryan, who was gracious enough to take time out of his fight prep to do this interview, I got to ask a certain question that I think you'll know what I mean by based upon Ryan's answer here.
I think, maintaining, it's kind of a weird situation because, I mean, for the most part, it seems like the rule of thumb is you don't eat where you eat when it comes to coaching an athlete, when it comes to dating an athlete that you're coaching. And I just feel like, obviously, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but for the most part, it seems like athletes that date their coaches, it usually ends up being nothing but trouble in the grand scheme of things. And so, I mean, like, my advice as a coach, especially if you're a married man, don't date your athletes, because you're probably gonna, end up causing some trouble in terms of, it'll cause trouble in your personal life. It'll cause trouble in the gym. You will probably develop some sort of animosity or resentment if you're dating your athlete, and then you're intertwining like a personal relationship that needs to be separated. Like, the only ones that are going to be successful are the coaches that are dating their athletes that can really separate their relationship from like a romantic relationship to a relationship as a coach and a fighter. And that is a very, very easy line to blur, which is probably why it doesn't work out the vast majority of the time.
But anyways, that's the entirety of the interview, which is not only my first ever interview with a fighter, but my first ever interview with a Ryzen fighter and an MMA coach. So here's a final word from Ryan.
if you guys are tuning in to Ryzen 53, be sure to use the pay-per-view at, be sure to buy the pay-per-view at Ryzen.tv, and be sure to go to their Instagram and Twitter and let them know that you're buying it because of myself and Nikki MMA, so you know, he doesn't get hashtag cucked by Fight Society.
So there, you've heard it from a fighter himself. Please ensure that I do not get cucked by Fight Society any longer. After watching UFC 328, make sure to go to Ryzen.tv and buy the pay-per-view for Ryzen 53 and spam in their Twitter and Instagram comments that you bought the pay-per-view from abroad because of Iniki MMA and Ryan Cafaro. And no, this isn't me doing any sort of paid promotion or anything like that, no. This is simply my effort to ensure that I'm no longer hashtag cucked by Fight Society. Anyways, that's the entirety of this video. Thank you for listening until the end, and I hope you picked up some insights regarding MMA coaching from Ryan here. Goodbye.